When we think of the Renaissance, probably first and foremost the names of artists come to our head. You walk into Florence and there's Brunelleschi's Dome. You go to the Accademia and there's Michelangelo's David. You go to the Uffizi and there's Botticelli's Birth of Venus, sometimes called Nude in a Half Shell. So those are the first images many people have when they think of the Italian Renaissance. However, we also know that the Renaissance is more than an artistic movement or a series of artistic movements. It's really a period of history that's important to us as modern people living in the 21st century for a number of reasons. For those who, of course, focus on literature, they begin the Renaissance, perhaps somewhat unfairly, as medievalists would think, with Dante Alighieri, and then go on to Petrarch and others, although Petrarch wasn't a Florentine. But pretty soon, you have to come to grips with one of the most interesting, enigmatic figures of the Renaissance or any other period, a fellow we call Niccolò Machiavelli. And that's what we're going to be talking about for quite a while in this series of lectures. This guy, Machiavelli. By the way, very often his first name is mispronounced. You've got an accent on the last O, and that means it's Niccolò rather than Niccolo. So Niccolò Machiavelli is going to be the subject of our inquiry. And we need to look at Machiavelli not just as a figure of the Renaissance, although he certainly is central to our understanding of what the Renaissance is all about, but also because he continues to be an important theorist, an important commentator on politics. In other words, we can say that as historians, we cannot ignore Machiavelli. It's been said that his most famous work, for example, The Prince, is the most important book of political science ever written. Some would say it's even the first book of political science, although you get Plato scholars and others who would certainly disagree with that by a long time. But Machiavelli's not just important for his historical contributions, what he added to his own time, but because Machiavelli continues to be read, but also streams of Machiavelli's thought have entered into the general Western political consciousness. In fact, at the end of this course, I'm going to argue, and from popular images of Machiavelli, this will seem odd to some people, but I'm going to argue that, in fact, there are important elements of Machiavelli in American Republican political thought, although it sounds odd to us because of the way we normally think of Machiavelli. Let me confess to being interested in both of those sides of Machiavelli. First of all, I'm a historian. I'm a medievalist by trade, so Machiavelli is sort of a modern guy for me. But nevertheless, it is important, since I teach courses on the Italian Renaissance, for example, simply to deal with Machiavelli in his period, right at the end of the 15th century, and he enters into the public world of Florence. He gets his first official Florentine government job in 1498, and he dies in 1527. So the end of the 15th, the early 16th century, we need to look at Machiavelli, the writer, and Machiavelli, to a lesser extent, the historical player in the activities of the Florentine Republic. But those of you who have seen perhaps other tapes I've made know that I took a semester off from teaching in 1998 and was a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives. You can probably tell by my appearance here, I lost. Nevertheless, I campaigned for 6 straight months and thought a great deal about modern politics and commented a great deal about modern politics in public as a candidate on television, in ads, and so on. So I am interested in Machiavelli personally, both as a historical figure whom I teach as part of a very important period of the development of the history of the West, but also as an ongoingly important political thinker in the Western world and really today in the whole world. Now, how do we conceive of Machiavelli? What's the popular image of Machiavelli today? Despite the fact that the most famous portrait we have of him shows Machiavelli with a kind of enigmatic grin, we don't usually think of Machiavelli as a fun guy. We don't usually think of him as a laugh-a-minute, a guy you'd sort of like to have a glass of wine with after the end of a long day. We think of him as intense. We think of him as driven. And of course, we think of him as being, well, how do we say it? Machiavellian. Somebody who in some ways encouraged or at least accepted the notion that dishonesty and deviousness are part of the political life. We often associate with him the phrase, the end justifies the means, although he never used that exact phrase. We think of him as someone who believes in a prince, in iron-fisted, get tough, don't worry about the details of justice kind of guy. After all, again, from the 16th century on, the word Machiavellian, or Machiavel in its earlier form, has been part of the English language. And therefore, that is, for most people, their modern image. If you want to say something to a friend of yours, or perhaps not a friend of yours, if you want to accuse him of being a little bit sleazy, a little bit self-centered, you say, that was Machiavellian of you, or you're a damn Machiavellian, or whatever it might be. Let me suggest, however, that obviously there is a dimension of Machiavelli's thought that we capture with that adjective Machiavellian as we use it today. However, such a reading of Machiavelli is quite incomplete. First of all, it implies a particular reading of Machiavelli's most famous work, The Prince, which he wrote in 1513. And I'm going to suggest both later in this lecture and in a series of lectures on Machiavelli's book, The Prince, that is a facile and at best partial reading of The Prince. It is much more than telling princes, get tough, knock a few heads, scheme, lie, plot, steal. That is hardly the theme of Machiavelli's The Prince. Obviously, one can pull passages out of the book and quote them and make him sound like, well, a Machiavellian in the way we use that term. But what I'm going to argue is, again, that's a facile reading, a partial reading of The Prince. There are a number of ways I would suggest to read The Prince that are perhaps more profitable. First of all, we need to look a little bit at historical context. The Prince was written hastily, shortly after Machiavelli went on a kind of self-imposed exile in Florence following the loss of his job with the return of the Medici to Florence. I'll go into all this detail a little bit later on, in 1512. And Machiavelli sat down quickly at his farm south of Florence to write this book, at least in part to say to the ruling Medici family, hey, Medici family, I'm Niccolo Machiavelli. I just lost my job. I understand politics. I understand if you're going to rule in Florence, and there was a Medici on the papal throne at this time, if you guys are going to rule in Italy, you better listen to what I say. I've got a formula that will actually help you to succeed. It is too simple to say The Prince is a job application by Machiavelli, but he certainly is saying, I've got a lot to teach you guys about how to run a republic. I understand this stuff. I've been working at it. I've been thinking about it. So pay attention. And we always need to consider the reason Machiavelli wrote The Prince and for whom he wrote it, which were members of the Medici family. Secondly, Machiavelli looks around Florence and Italy in 1513, and what he sees is a mess. About 20 years earlier, the French had invaded Italy, and then it seemed, at least to Machiavelli and many of his contemporaries, that the rest of Italy was also descended upon by Germans and Swiss and almost anybody, later on the Spaniards, coming into Italy. Italy's a mess. Italy's really screwed up. And therefore, Machiavelli is very interested in the question, how do we get Italy working again? How do we get it functioning again? How do we restore some sort of order in a world, the Italian peninsula, that looks awfully chaotic? Again, it would make no sense to read Machiavelli's The Prince without concerning ourselves with the historical context of its writing and the historical context of Italy, and we will indeed do both of those things. The last chapter of The Prince is a call to drive what Machiavelli calls the barbarians, all those foreigners, out of Italy. And he talks about Italy as an idea. And therefore, often, especially in the 19th century, during the time when Italy became a unified nation, and in the first half of the 20th century, when extreme Italian nationalism dominated the politics, as we know, of the Italian peninsula, Machiavelli was looked on as a kind of prophet, a kind of figure who announced a plan to make Italy a nation, to make Italy great again. And so one of the legacies of us in the 21st century is a lot of 19th and 20th century use of Machiavelli as a political thinker about the unity of Italy, about the creation of the Italian nation. In fact, during the so-called Risorgimento in the 19th century, Machiavelli and Dante were the two great figures who were looked at as laying out sort of the theory and the prophecy of a unified Italian state. And again, I'll have more to say about that, especially at the end of the course in the very last lecture. So looking at that brief list, it reminds us that simply to read The Prince, or as people often do, snippets of The Prince, without any sense of the context and the reason for Machiavelli writing, is going to lead us to a false understanding of who this guy was and what he had to say. It's also very important to remember that Machiavelli left us a lot of writings, that sometimes we seem to operate as if The Prince is the corpus of Machiavelli's writing, and that is far from so. In fact, he would fill a fairly nice niche on a bookshelf with his writings. And let me simply suggest something of the scope of those. In addition to The Prince, which is a very thin book, we have a book that he began about the same time as The Prince, which in different translations has somewhat different titles, but perhaps the fullest title would be Discourses on the First 10 Books of Livy. Livy was a great Roman historian at the period of the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. And even though we only have a fragment of Livy's work, we do have the first 10 books of Livy's history, which is from the legendary founding of Rome through the early Republic of Rome. And Machiavelli wrote a long, not quite commentary, but a book based on his reading and his application of Livy to the current events, his reading of early Roman history. It's a very exciting and interesting book. It's a very thick book. And therefore, it's not read nearly as often as The Prince is. Furthermore, sometimes it's hard to make complete sense out of reading the discourses because he's discoursing on Livy. And if you haven't read Livy and you don't know some of the major players in the history of the early Roman Republic, then his examples sort of wash by us because he assumes that his audience has read or is at least generally familiar with Livy. And so this is an underappreciated book. But if you read what scholars say about Machiavelli, although they will not all agree, most would say, I will say, that the Discourses is the most substantial and important book that Machiavelli wrote. And there it is very clear, it is out in the open, it's not hidden, it's not something that subtle scholars see. There Machiavelli makes clear, I am a Republican. Small r, of course. I believe in the Republican form of government. The Romans had the best form of government. They were the most successful and the most just society. And the fact that we've moved so far away from those Roman Republican principles that are so well enunciated in Livy, Machiavelli argues, that's one way of understanding why we're in such a mess today. And so we're going to focus quite a bit, even more than on The Prince, on Machiavelli's Discourses. And I think we'll find that's an exciting thing to do. Toward the end of his life, Machiavelli wrote a history of Florence, actually commissioned by the Medici. He never got a real job back in terms of being in power in the Medici period of Florentine rule, but he did sort of make his peace with the Medici, and they commissioned him to write a history of Florence, starting from the beginning, when Florence was founded in Roman times, And that book ends with the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492, when Machiavelli himself was actually 23 years old. And so in a discussion, somewhat brief in this course, but nevertheless a real discussion of the Florentine histories, the title is sometimes translated a little bit differently, the history of Florence or whatever, but I'm using a translation that translates the title as Florentine Histories, plural. We're going to be seeing Machiavelli, the historian of his own hometown, and also, of course, of his own nation, since Florence was an independent nation, or we might say, better today, city-state. So those are the works we're going to focus on, and I'm going to be doing sort of real commentaries on in this course. The Prince, the Discourses, and the Florentine Histories. However, that hardly altogether makes up the body of Machiavelli's work. For example, he did not publish the Discourses or the Prince in his own lifetime. He did publish one political work called The Art of War. He wrote a biography of a 14th century military leader in Italy, Castruccio Castracani. He wrote a lot of letters. He wrote some plays. He wrote a lot of political materials as he was an employee of the Florentine government between 1498 and 1512. And so there is a large body of work. I'm going to try to draw indirectly on some of those things. The letters are of particular import, and by the way, they've just been made available in an English translation, the first English translation of the entire correspondence to and from Machiavelli. And they certainly help fill in some of the personal history of Machiavelli, what he's thinking at the time. And I am going to be quoting at some length from one of those letters, the most famous one, written at the time that he was writing The Prince, to give us an idea of how that body of material is useful in informing us on who this Machiavelli guy is and sort of what's going on in his head beyond what he formally puts on paper with the expectation of it being published, being made public. And so we do need to appreciate the fact that Machiavelli is not just a guy who wrote The Prince, but he is the author of a considerable body of literature. And the more we read, in a sense, the more complex Machiavelli gets. The more fully we get to know a guy who can do everything from write an intensely political treatise, to be a brilliant historical commentator, to give us a look at his day-to-day life, and even to describe in somewhat vulgar detail in one of his letters one of his sexual encounters with a prostitute. We get a fuller picture of Machiavelli the more that we look at all of his writings. And so, how am I going to go about setting the context for you before we begin to read The Prince and the Discourses and the Florentine Histories? First, in the very next lecture, we're going to be looking at the history of Florence. You better hold your breath because we're going to do about 1,500 years in 30 minutes. So I'm probably going to leave out a detail or two. But nevertheless, we need to look at this city of which he is a part, this city in which he is such a patriot, this city in which the Machiavelli family is a very old and well-established family. Secondly, if he lives in Florence during the Renaissance, we need to define not only what Florence is, but what the Renaissance is, particularly focusing on the intellectual movement, or what's been called the educational program of the Renaissance, which we call humanism. And therefore, I'm going to try to present Machiavelli as a humanist thinker. In order to do that, we need to take some time out and ask exactly what we mean by the terms humanist and humanism. Finally, before we begin, before we get all revved up, looking at the writings of Machiavelli, I will give one lecture that will be the biography of Machiavelli, looking at his life from the date of his birth, 1469, the year that Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici takes power in Florence, until his death in 1527. And we'll get to know him a little bit personally. We'll get to know about his career, and we will be able to order and contextualize into his life, as well as into the intellectual and political context of what's going on in Florence, the writings of Niccolò Machiavelli. it's clear that Machiavelli matters. He matters to those who are interested in the history of the Renaissance. He matters to people who are interested in politics in our own time. And I want to reiterate some of the ideas behind the statements that not only Machiavelli mattered, but that he matters for us as well. Machiavelli, so famous, has been written about so many times by so many people in so many contexts, that we find that one of the many phrases that's gotten attached to him is that he's the first modern man. Now, that's a hell of a mantle to hang on anybody, that he's the first modern man. And obviously, any phrase like that is something of an exaggeration. It dramatizes the break he made with his own tradition. It de-emphasizes continuity. It takes away from the real contributions of many other thinkers in Florence, in Italy, in other parts of Europe, in terms of how we try to understand the break between then and now, between the ancient and medieval world on the one hand and modernity on the other. But nevertheless, if you're going to hang that tag, the first modern man, on somebody, then Machiavelli is a credible candidate. And we're going to explore why that is. In what ways does he break from a long tradition of political thought, of Republican political thought, that we can trace back to the ancients? We can trace back to Aristotle. We can trace back to Cicero. And how is it that Machiavelli really is somebody and something new? Machiavelli matters because we so often associate him with glorifying, I'm simply saying what I said before in different words, glorifying amorality or immorality, at least among those who rule. And that's an important issue. It's not a completely new issue. Plato talked about the idea of whether there was such a thing as a noble lie or not. But some of the counsels of Machiavelli that we'll look at in detail certainly sound like he's saying that for a leader, anything goes. What he certainly is saying is that the idea that there's a traditional personal morality and that political morality is simply personal morality writ large, Machiavelli is saying that doesn't work. It's not a description of reality, and it is a prescription for disaster. That as a ruler, one needs to operate by a somewhat different code than one operates as a private citizen, as a dad, or a mom, or a husband, or a wife. And one of the things that we can see, it's not totally new in Machiavelli, is the development of the notion that somehow there are different moral realms, public and private, with sort of different playing rules. You can't simply say one is the extension of the other, but rather they have to work differently, because some of the things that might make you a good person will make you a bad and unsuccessful ruler, and vice versa. So we're going to have to deal with the question, is Machiavelli introducing a new political morality? Is he really amoral without morals? Or is he immoral by saying sometimes it's okay for princes to lie, to be cruel, and whatever? These are important questions. They mattered in the 16th century. They matter now. I also want to take up the issue that Machiavelli, as I suggested, especially from the discourses, is an important Republican thinker. And we all know, however democratic we are as a nation, that our nation was founded as a republic. Think of the Pledge of Allegiance, and to the republic for which it stands. We know that when we read Madison and the other framers of the Constitution, Madison was terrified of at least an Athenian-style democracy and praised the republic. Those who argued for the ratification of the Constitution even took on Latin names that were the names of Roman thinkers of the Republican period. And so we have to ask, doesn't Machiavelli matter as a Republican thinker to us, since we live in a republic, a democratic republic to be sure, but nevertheless a republic. How are some of the ways in which Machiavelli's thought may matter to us who live in a republic? Well, one of the things we praise ourselves and our Constitution for is that we have a system of checks and balances, a system in which one part of the power is modified or controlled by another. And that's something Machiavelli is very interested in. Again, more in the discourses than in the Prince. But he's very interested in what we would call, it's not his phrase, a system of checks and balances. We very often talk about, in our republic, a need for people to operate for the common good. It's a phrase we hear over and over again. Well, Machiavelli talks a great deal about the common good, about doing things for the good of the whole rather than a good for any one part. And therefore, that's another part of Machiavelli's thought that might contribute to us thinking about ourselves and understanding ourselves. Another thing we constantly hear in our American politics is that different political skills are needed in different eras. That is to say, you needed a certain kind of president because of a certain kind of situation, whether it was World War II or the Cold War or the boom of the 90s or whatever it was. And somebody who might have been great in one era, those skills might not have served him well as ruler of another era when different skills are needed. And that's something we often talk about. We might say it today, finding the right person for the right political job at the right time. Machiavelli talks a good deal about the fact that different skills are needed at different times and whether it is possible and to what extent it's possible for people to adapt to changing situations. And Machiavelli will examine that in some detail. So that what I would argue is if we are interested in the history and practice of republicanism, if we're interested in what we usually mean when we use the word republic, Machiavelli historically has been a contributor to the development of Republican thought in the West, and Machiavelli is a commentator that has insights for us today in the 21st century, and we will not find those insights if we simply say, let's look at a few snippets, let's look at the highlights reel of Machiavelli's The Prince. So let me reiterate, as I bring this lecture to a close, again, what we're going to do. I'm going to provide a good deal of background. Once again, it's going to be the history of Florence, the history of Renaissance thought, which we're going to call humanism or humanist thought, and biographical information on Niccolò Machiavelli. Then we're going to turn systematically to a reading, a very close reading, what some today, a term I like, call text crawling. We're going to go through the text slowly. We're going to stop and think about certain passages of three major works of Machiavelli: The Prince, the Discourses on Livy, and Machiavelli's Florentine Histories. And only when we have looked at those works in some detail, and alas, at the end of 24 lectures, you're going to say, damn it, just getting started on this Machiavelli guy. I wish we had more time. Of course, what I'm going to say at that point is get the books and read them. And hopefully this lecture course will, among other things, prepare you to be a good reader of those and other works of Machiavelli. Finally, we're going to close this course with a look at Machiavelli's thought after Machiavelli is laid in his tomb, by the way, which you can go visit in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. We're going to look at the reception of Machiavelli's thought in his own century, the 16th century. He dies in 1527. We're going to look at it in English Republican thought. I'm going to talk about Machiavelli's thought as it comes into the American discussion and discourse about representative government and Republican government. And then, again, we're going to say what role might Machiavelli play in making us better thinkers and players in the political realm in the years 2006 and for many years after that. That's the goal. I welcome you along. It's going to be a good trip. It's going to be fun.